your mind isn't that dark and twisted. Why don't you go on AO3 and start searching through the tags, and I bet you'll find something a lot more dark and twisted that's happening in like One Direction fan fiction than what was happening in your literary novel. So what I really wanted to do was make a video talking about this book I recently read called The Book of Illusions by Paul Auster. And I decided I had to add a little oomph to that video concepts because it came out in 2002 and no one cares. And it's not like he's recently come under scrutiny. In fact, he passed away in April. So we're not even anticipating a new release from the guy. There's no point in me talking about it besides that I had such strong feelings about this book. I didn't like it. Spoiler alert, I did not like it. And I love hating on books when they deserve it. That's what I wanted to do. And then I was like, you know what? Since no one cares, let me fold that rant, that ire, into a video that makes a little bit more sense. Books I've bought recently and books I've read recently. We'll call it a mid-fall check-in. I recently finished 5 books, and I also recently purchased 5 books. So yeah, this is like the mid-fall reading check-in for myself. By the way, I'm really sorry if my hair looks crazy. It's in that weird like half dry, like I washed it 2 hours ago. My hair is really thick and it takes a really long time to dry, and it's like almost dry but still a little bit damp. I don't know. Okay, let's start with let's go in order. So the last 5 books I read, the 5th most recent was Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I read this book, I finished it on September 13th, so it's, been less than a month, actually. And I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's, a classic. And it's the second ever Dickens novel. No. That I've read. It's the second Dickens novel that I've read. I have an issue with Dickens, which is, I think his writing is really good. I just don't like his characters. The man's never heard of character development. That's just not really what he's after. It's not really what he cares about. And that is fine, except that his book is 900 pages. So it's hard for me to read about people for 900 pages who don't change and are seemingly unaffected by like the events that happen to them. For the most part, at least in Bleak House, all of the characters kind of remain unchanged. Like even one character sort of has like an arc where he goes a little bit crazy. He gets obsessed with like this lawsuit that's happening that he's involved in, and he becomes like very unhinged, and then nothing happens. Whatever, it was enjoyable. I had a good time reading it. It's a classic of Victorian literature, like, and it really feeds into those Victorian stereotypes, like the big scary buildings and the ghost stories and the little orphans running amok. And there's like, it follows sort of a mystery. There is sort of this like central mystery that keeps the plot going. And fun things happen, like spontaneous combustion and children born out of wedlock. And that's all very well and good, but it didn't hit me very hard. There's just other Victorian writers I like more. I like George Eliot a lot. I hate the Brontes, and I could go on for hours about how much I hate the Brontes. So compared to Jane Eyre, which has similar plot elements and similar characters, although very different themes and very different writing, I'll take Bleak House over Jane Eyre. At least I managed to finish Bleak House. I couldn't even make it through Jane Eyre. God, I hate that book. Okay. Anyway, I read Bleak House. Let's talk about a book I recently purchased. And I have one, actually, from, like, the same era. No, earlier. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is the Barnes & Noble Signature Classics edition, but I got it used. I don't know how I feel about this edition. I'm really picky with classics. You'll notice my edition of Bleak House is a Penguin Classics, and I actually got this one, you can tell, also used. It's literally yellow. It was a Penguin Classics edition, which I love those. I love the Penguin Classics. I love how they look all together on my shelf. So good. This I'm not loving. I like it enough. I mean, I bought this edition. I just didn't want to I was like, you know what? This is good enough. I don't need to go to a different bookstore and try and find a different edition. Anyway, every year in October, I like to read a Halloween book. And this year I decided to do Frankenstein because I'd never read it before, which is crazy. And I think I'll like it. One of the most famous monsters of all time, so what better to read during the Halloween season? And I again could go on and on for hours about the severely lacking horror genre in literature. Horror novels are just not good, at least ones I've read, and don't tell me about Stephen King. I have literally no interest in reading Stephen King's writing. Maybe I would check out one of his books, maybe I've heard Pet Sematary is good, but from everything I've ever heard, the films tend to be better than the books in his case, and just popular writing isn't necessarily good writing, and I just don't need to. Okay, I don't know how I got onto Stephen King. Anyway, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm gonna read this next after the book that I'm currently reading, which I will be showing you. Okay, and then the next book I read, so after Bleak House, I read Truth and Beauty by Anne Patchett. This is a memoir. Oh, by the way, I want to say every single book I'm showing you, I bought used / was given to me, except for one. And I'll show you that one. This I got used. I'd never heard of it. Anne Patchett is a fantastic writer. I have read her nonfiction, I've read her fiction, and I follow her bookstore on TikTok, and I write down all of her book recommendations, and sometimes I even read them. And one of her books, Dutch House, is in my top 5 favorites of all time. I love Anne Patchett. I'd never heard of Truth and Beauty, but I saw it at the used bookstore. I bought it because of the author, because it's Anne Patchett, and I will read anything Anne Patchett writes. And this was beautiful. This is a memoir about her friend Lucy Greeley, who was also a writer, who is best known for her autobiography of a face. It's the title of her memoir, Autobiography of a Face. This book was published 2 years after Lucy passed away, and it's about their friendship, and it's really beautiful, and it is really emotional, and if you cry at all easily, you will be sobbing by the time you finish this book. This book, I think about it a lot since I finished writing it. Whoa. Yeah, I wrote this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Anne Patchett and Lucy Greeley, they went to college together, and then they ended up living together for grad school, and they both got their MFAs at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is one of the most iconic MFA programs in the country. And then it sort of follows them after they leave Iowa, and they are both pursuing being writers, and they do different writers residencies, and then they both end up finding career success. Lucy is chronically ill, and she is constantly dealing with medical issues, and has been since she was a child, and so that's also not only affected her physical development, but also her she has depression, and she's a very anxious person, and she's a very complicated person. And I think the way that Anne Patchett writes her is she really knows this woman and understands her very deeply, and can present her as flawed but also still lovable, interesting, just a very interesting mind. Wrote letters to each other, and some of Lucy's letters are included in this book, so in a way it's almost like she had a hand in writing it. I mean, we know from the jump that Lucy has died. I mean, she obviously everyone knew that she was dead when the book came out, so it's still really hard to read, especially towards the end. There's a lot of self-destructive behavior. It's really hard, and I think if you've ever had to witness a friend struggling, or you've struggled and felt a burden on your friends, this will emotionally affect you. Also, there's interesting stuff about being a writer and being a woman and like being young and wanting to be a writer, which I found really relatable. And there's so much stuff in there that like really affected me. I'm still thinking about it a lot, and a lot of times when I read books, I like don't really think about them after I've read them. That's Truth and Beauty. The next book I purchased recently, I'm trying to have them all line up. So like for Bleak House, I did Frankenstein. So for Truth and Beauty, I'm going to talk about The Portable Dorothy Parker. This was edited by Marian Mead, but it includes the version of this book that Dorothy Parker herself put together in the 1940s, and then Marian Mead put together a larger collection after Dorothy Parker passed away. And I wouldn't say this is portable. I would say it's quite heavy because it is like a large anthology of Dorothy Parker. Oh my god. There are poems in here. There's also short stories, essays, letters, I believe, as well. So there's a lot in there. Dorothy Parker has a reputation as like this like very witty, sharp, outspoken woman, kind of like a sassy, broad figure. Which is so much fun. I've never read any Dorothy Parker, but I'm sure I would love her stuff. Like, I'm sure I'm going to love it based on what I know about it. I think it's gonna be really cool. And part of why I bought this book actually is because I've been rewatching Gilmore Girls, and at one point Rory reads this book, The Portable Dorothy Parker, and I was like, you know what? Rory isn't better than me. I can read The Portable Dorothy Parker as well, and I'll do it without cheating on any of my boyfriends. This is a Rory Gilmore hate page, but she does have good taste in literature. The next book I read was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I reread it. I have an entire video about that. It's like the only other video I've ever made, and you can go watch that. So the next book I bought, 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. I've been really interested in backlisted literary fiction from the 80s to 2000s because I feel like a lot of literary fiction from the 80s to 2000s is like not talked about anymore. Like there are a few novels that still get brought up, and I think mostly they get brought up if the author is currently still writing like bestsellers like Barbara Kingsolver or Anne Patchett. But for the most part, like I don't know much about like what was going on with literature at the time, and besides like Toni Morrison and Philip Roth, I feel like most of those authors have like yet to make it into our like definition of modern classics. I took a look at the Pulitzer Prize winner for every year in like history, and I didn't recognize a lot of the titles from like the end of the 20th century. And one of those titles was 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. This did actually win the Pulitzer in 1992, I believe. And I'd never heard of Jane Smiley, but she's been following me around. So I heard someone talk about this book online, and then I went downstairs one morning and my mom had like 4 copies of a different one of her books on our like dining room table, and I was like, okay, this woman is following me around. And then I was at a used bookstore and I saw this book, so I decided, you know, I had written it down anyway, like I'll just buy it because clearly the universe wants me to read her. This is interesting. It's just so interesting to me that a book can win like one of the most coveted prizes in literature, and that won't necessarily make it something that like we're still talking about. But I guess I did buy this book, so, and I'm gonna read it and talk, and I'm talking about it now, so maybe that's not even true. Oh, DeLillo, that's another writer that I feel like people still talk about from this period. But like, has anyone my age read any DeLillo? Like, I read White Noise because my mom forced me to. Otherwise, I never even probably would have heard of him. I just think it's interesting. I don't know, like, what creates a legacy? Like, how do writers stay remembered? Because you can win a ton of awards and maybe not be remembered. Even if your book is like really good, you might not be remembered. Even if you've published like upwards of 10 titles, you might not be remembered. So that's just something to think about. 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. You can tell this is a used book. Like, This is a retelling of King Lear, the Shakespeare play, but it's set on a farm in the Midwest, and I thought that was a really interesting setting for a King Lear retelling because I feel like other King Lear retellings, I guess I'm specifically thinking of Succession, the TV show, maintains the idea of the family being like rich and powerful, but in this story, it is a farmer and his farm in the Midwest, and I don't even know that they're necessarily like very wealthy. Maybe they are, I haven't read the book, but it just seems like they're just regular farmers. It's a regular American family. I thought that was interesting, like when you take away the social power and the wealth of King Lear, like what's left is just the family elements. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is a very successful book and hopefully it's really good. I've heard good things about it. Yeah, backlisted books, you guys. The next book I read was Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Lots of 19th century writing going on today. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman is a long poem. This edition is a reprinting of the original 1855 edition, so he reprinted a bunch of editions during his lifetime and he kept adding poems to the collection. So the poem Song of Myself is the longest one, and it's like the one that's like the most famous and is considered like the Leaves of Grass poem. There are other poems in the collection. So it has 12 poems, including Song of Myself, the main guy, the big kahuna. And this was my first time reading it, but it is considered like an absolute classic, and Walt Whitman is considered like one of the greatest American poets, the father of the transcendentalist poetry movement, and like the father of American poetry in general. Never read any Whitman. I'm not a great poetry reader because when I read poetry collections, I feel like I tend to just speed through them, and then I feel like I didn't get enough out of it, and like I didn't do it right, and like I didn't understand what I was doing. But this time I just felt really called to read this. I've had this book sitting around for 6 years, literally had it since I was a junior in high school. And I just always kept it because I was like, it's a famous work and I want to get to it eventually, and like I've heard good things about it and blah blah blah. And I finally was in the mood to read it, and I decided to go through it and with a pencil and like annotate it, and annotating really helped me slow down and appreciate the language. I didn't even annotate that much. I would literally just underline things that called out to me and stuff or whatever. Like I didn't even really do that much annotating, and also reading it out loud was really helpful. And I ended up loving it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Like, it was so good. I really enjoyed Song of Myself, To Think of Time, and I Sing the Body Electric. Those were my favorites. Also, I Sing the Body Electric is literally a Lana Del Rey song, so shout out to Walt Whitman for making a Lana Del Rey reference in his writing. I love that for him. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it actually inspired me to get more poetry and read more poetry. Like, I can do it. It's not scary. Yeah, so that inspired me to get more poetry. And so then when I was at the bookstore, I was like, let me get a book of poems. So I went into their used poetry book section, and I got Louise Glück. This is a collection of the first 4, it's called The First 4 Books of Poems. It's a binding of the first 4 books of poetry that she ever published, which you can see is like quite slim considering it's 4 books in here. She did end up winning the Pulitzer in poetry for a different book called The Wild Iris, but this collection has Firstborn, The House on Marshland, Descending Figure, and The Triumph of Achilles. And I feel like that'll give me a really great sense of who she is as a poet. Louise Glück, from my understanding, is a contemporary American poet. Most of this stuff was published in the 80s and 90s, which again is like total blind spot with reading. I never read anything that was published between honestly 1960 and 2000. I obviously read stuff that was published then, but it is a blind spot for me. I don't know, because I guess we're just not really taught about it in school, and then obviously contemporary lit is a lot easier to get your hands on, so it's just harder to find stuff that isn't the most famous stuff. Louise Glück is a super famous poet. I definitely heard of her before, but I'm just not sure I've ever read any of her stuff. But most of her poems are quite short. You can see I literally just opened to a random page and they're both very short. And I think she writes in free verse. And I don't know what movement she would be a part of. I really don't know much about poetry. I know absolutely nothing about contemporary poetry. I barely know any poets. So Yeah, I'm really excited to read this. I actually kind of want to read it soon, and I'm just like really excited about being excited about poetry, if that makes sense. Like, I'm really excited that I'm finally getting into poetry, that I feel like the urge to do it, and I want to chase that impulse. Finally, at the thing that made me want to make this video in the first place, which is the most recent book I have finished it yesterday, and that is The Book of Illusions by Paul Auster. I really did not like it. I did end up giving it 2 stars, and I'll get to why I did that. I was really excited to read some of Paul Auster's fiction. I really enjoyed Paul Auster's memoir, which is called The Invention of Solitude. It was published in 1982. His memoir was the first thing he ever published, and he wrote a lot of books. He is just very prolific, and he is regarded as like a high literary author, so has a positive reputation. His memoir is about his dad, and he wrote it after his dad passed away, and I loved it. I read it like 2 years ago, and I had never heard of him before I read it. It was just given to me by a friend, and it was so fantastic, and I still think about it all the time, and it's probably one of my favorite memoirs I've ever read. So I was super excited to check out his fiction, and I know his most famous fiction is his New York trilogy, which is like 3 novellas. I ended up with this one, The Book of Illusions, I think also because this one is about like film, like silent film, and I have a film degree, so I was like, you know what, let me do this one, like that sounds right up my alley. And it was such a letdown, and I'm like really unhappy and sad about it, and like I kind of want to give his writing another chance, so maybe I'll read the New York trilogy and see. This was also the 10th book he published, and sometimes an author's later work is their best stuff, sometimes it's their worst stuff. Like it really depends, and maybe that's just the case with Auster. Like maybe his earlier work is better. I'm gonna try again with him, but I was really let down. The first 100 pages of this book I actually did really enjoy. So the premise is this professor who, right at the start of the novel, his wife and 2 children all die in a plane crash, and the first 100 pages sort of follow him in the aftermath, the first 3 years after the plane crash. And at one point he gets obsessed with this silent film star who's fictional, named Hector Mann, and he watches all of his films and writes a book about him. And this guy was like kind of forgotten, and the like thing about this guy Hector Mann is like he made a couple of movies and then he like disappeared from the face of the earth. Everyone obviously thought he was dead, and then the professor gets a letter that's like, this guy's alive and he wants to meet you, and he has even more movies that have never been seen by the public and you should come watch them. And a woman ends up showing up to his house who's like kind of related to Hector Mann, and she's like, you should come to this ranch in New Mexico where this guy lives and meet him and like watch the rest of his movies because he's about to die, and after he dies the unreleased movies are going to be destroyed. The first 100 pages before that woman shows up to his house, and literally when this woman shows up is when everything goes to hell. The first 100 pages sort of follow this professor watching all these movies, and there's like entire passages where he's describing these movies. It's written in the style of a film essay. Like he'll describe the shot and then like what the significance of the shot is and like what the artistic intention behind it was and like all this stuff, and it literally sounds like an essay that like I've written before or like had to read before, and I really enjoyed that. It was a really interesting like writing exercise to me, like writing about a movie that doesn't exist, and like you have to see that visual image so strongly in your own head in order to be able to like write it down in a novel. It really does take like a lot of imagination, I feel like. And that was part of why I gave this book 2 stars, is the way that Auster was able to create this character, and more than the character, like his body of work, like the 12 films that this guy made. I thought that was like very masterfully done and very cool, and I really enjoyed reading that. But the actual events of the novel made me want to die. So basically this woman shows up and ruins the book. So I'm gonna start spoiling it now, so if you do for some reason want to read this book, go to the next like timestamp that I've listed, and I'll just be talking about a different book. But from here on I'm just gonna start spoiling and maybe get a little irritated. I don't know. I was really irritated reading this book. This woman shows up to his house to take him to this ranch, and bitch pulls a gun. Okay, so she pulls a gun on him and he's like, shoot me, I don't care. And then she like freaks out and is like, I can't do it. And he takes the gun from her and he almost like shoots himself, but then he doesn't. And she like has a panic attack and hides in his bathroom. And it's like so strange. The woman's name is Alma, and she's just, why would you pull a gun on him? Why would you pull a gun on him? She's literally like, please come to this ranch. And he's like, no. And also, why doesn't he want to go to the ranch? Like, it's literally, he's just saying no for the plot, literally for the convenience of the plot. There's nothing about this man that leads me to believe that he wouldn't want to meet, like, he very much admires Hector Man. He wants to know what happened to him. Like, why did this guy disappear? They're literally like, oh, please come and like meet him and like watch his movies. And this guy is like, no, I don't want to. Why don't you want to? Like, you have nothing else going on anyway. Like, it's just so stupid. But he just keeps saying no. And then she pulls a gun on him. And it's like, girl, why are we pulling guns on people? It just like didn't need to be like that. It just didn't need to be like that is really all I have to say about that. Yeah. And then she like has a panic attack and is like hiding in his bathroom, and I'm like, this is insane. She needs to leave. Like, what is this? Like, I thought we were just gonna go to this ranch and have a good time. She comes out of the bathroom and you would not believe what happens. Like, maybe you would, but if you can take a guess as to where this goes next, like, this is again a male author writing this book, and that should be your biggest clue as to what happens next, because obviously we can't have a woman who is the same age as the main male character show up in the text and he doesn't fuck her, because then he would be not a man, he would be impotent and a loser. So he obviously has to have sex with her. She pulls a gun on him, he takes the gun from her, she's screaming at him like, oh my god, because he's like acting like he's gonna shoot himself. She's just screaming like, don't shoot yourself, don't shoot yourself. She hides in his bathroom, has a panic attack, and then she comes out of the bathroom and he's like, you can sleep here, it's fine. And they end up fucking. What? Like, excuse me, but what? And then they wake up the next morning and he's like, okay, I'll go to New Mexico with you. Now, I swear on like the life of my dog that I thought pages of this book were missing, because they wake up in the morning and they decide to go to New Mexico together to go to this ranch, and they get in the car and they go to the airport and they're making out in the airport, and then he has a fear of flying because obviously his whole family died in a plane crash, but he like is okay because he has Alma with him. Fucking pardon? You met last night and she pulled a gun on you. I literally thought there were pages missing where like they had this conversation where they realized that they were like long lost soulmates or something, or like knew each other in a past life. Like, I could not put together why they were acting like these. They had like known each other forever, but they literally like they have sex and then they're like immediately like dating, and they're like there's no conversation about it. They're just like physically affectionate in public and then like talking about how they're like falling for each other. And he literally says like she's bringing him back to life after the passing of his wife. And like, look, grief does crazy things to a guy, I get it, but like, that's a stranger. So they show up to the ranch and he meets Hector, and it's very anticlimactic. They talk for 5 minutes and then he gets like taken out of the room because Hector like needs to go to sleep, and then Hector literally dies in the night. So here's the thing about this book. The middle of the book, about 100 pages, is Hector's backstory. So while they're like flying to New Mexico, Alma is telling the professor Hector's entire life of basically what happened after he disappeared up until now. And basically what happened is insane. It's so high drama. Like, this book is so high drama, but it's treated with the gravitas of like literary fiction. Like, everything that happens in this book is literally a telenovela, and it's treated with like the most intense like gravitas, like although as though we are reading like Dostoevsky. Like, it literally makes no sense. Hector's backstory, real quick: he is working in Hollywood. He is having an affair with this reporter, Bridget, who is obsessed with him, and then he's gonna get married to someone else. So Bridget gets really upset and she goes crazy and she tries to take her own life, but then she finds out she is pregnant, and then she confronts Hector's fiance and is like, I'm pregnant. Fiance accidentally kills her. Well, I'm like, accidentally how? But she like accidentally shoots her, and Hector helps the fiance hide the body. They bury the body, and they both go their separate ways, and Hector disappears, and that's why he disappears. And he changes his name, and then for a couple of years he's sort of roaming around. So he ends up going up to the town where Bridget was from, and he like ingratiates himself to her family under an assumed name and works for her dad. And her sister falls in love with him, and then he's like, oh no, the sister fell in love with me, I have to leave. Okay, so he moves on from there, and then he ends up in Chicago, and this woman, a sex worker, is like, hey, like, do you want to do sex work with me, and we'll do like a live sex show for clients? And he's like, yes, like, I am damned, I am evil, this is what I should do, like, I deserve to be completely debased in this way. And it's like, all right, not too much now. And they end up doing a live sex show, and I think this is where there is a stunning lack of imagination, because it's literally very tame. And like, look, I wasn't expecting anything crazy, but like, I've read Otessa Moshfegh, I've read Bret Easton Ellis. Like, when you tell me our character is going to participate in a live sex show, I'm expecting Cabaret. You know what I mean? As in like the musical Cabaret. But nothing interesting happens. He literally just has sex with this woman. It's him and a woman. And they have sex in front of groups of people, or sometimes in front of one person. And they don't do anything that like insane. Like, it's regular old, plain old vanilla sex. They do that for a couple of months, and then he leaves. Boring. Yawn. So yeah, that happens. Like, literally, like, what was the point of that? Literally, what was the point of that? I feel like that was Paul Auster being like, look how dark and twisted my mind is. And it's like, your mind isn't that dark and twisted. Why don't you go on AO3 and start searching through the tags, and I bet you'll find something a lot more dark and twisted that's happening in like One Direction fan fiction than what was happening in your literary novel. Like, I'm sorry, there's more graphic sex scenes in Madame Bovary, and that was published 100 years before this one was, almost 200 years before. After he does that in Chicago, he ends up going to Ohio, where he meets his wife, and they move to New Mexico together, and they start making these secret films. And the only way, he like loves filmmaking, but he feels like he shouldn't be allowed to make films because of what he did to Bridget. So the only way he can like get himself to make films is like if they're a secret and no one ever sees them. So he tells his wife that after he dies, they have to be destroyed within 24 hours. Back to the present, the professor shows up, he meets Hector, Hector dies immediately. So the professor and Alma are like kind of this like little dream team. And the wife, Hector's wife, her name is Frida. Frida starts burning all the movies and is like, you need to leave. And so the professor leaves. So he like is barely at the ranch for any amount of time. Like, there was no point in him going to the ranch at all. He leaves, and then he makes a plan with Alma for her to like pack up all of her stuff and come live with him. And she has been spending the last 7 years writing Hector's biography. And so she's going to take her manuscript and like go meet up with the professor, and they're going to live together happily ever after because they are in love, even though they met like 2 days before this. Yeah. Oh my god, like, it's so cringe. Like, there's the scenes where they're being like romantic with each other. It's just like this is two bitches with anxious attachment styles confusing butterflies for love. Listen, they match each other's freak at the end of the day. They match each other's freak. But y'all are in your late 30s and you're acting like you're 16. Like, I don't know about all this. So he leaves, and then he's expecting Alma to meet up with him. But then Frida basically goes insane, and she does destroy Alma's manuscript. And so Alma gets really upset, and she pushes Frida, and Frida falls, and Frida dies. And then Alma takes her own life because she feels like she killed Frida. And the professor lives. And then it turns out that like this book is actually him writing like his memoir of this time, because he like lives a long life and never tells anyone about it. And he's like, if you're reading this, then I have passed away, and we're reading it, so I guess he died. And Paul Auster himself just died, so that felt like a very nice like little completion in the narrative. This book was trash. Those events, I'm telling you, like, they were so insane, and they weren't, like, the style of the writing did not match the insanity of the events of the book. So I just felt like I was getting whiplash, and I literally was like, this is insane. This guy, okay, he literally sends her a fax, first of all, it's just so funny, but it's like it's set in the 80s, so whatever. He sends her a fax where he says, I love you, and I was like, this is fucking insane. Why are we saying I love you? And that's when I was like, okay, I must have missed pages. Like, this is a used copy, there must be pages taken out. But no, on the very next page, he's like, I can't believe I only met her 8 days ago. Police. This is so Love is Blind of them. This is so 90 Day Fiance. But it's like, what was that for? I was reading some reviews online. One person on Goodreads said that this is a really classic example of an issue that happens in a lot of Auster's fiction, apparently, which is he starts off very strong, which I believe he did, and then he gets bored or something, and he just like needs to wrap it up, and so he ends up just doing like random shit to wrap it up. And it really feels like that is what happened. Like, it feels like he had a really good idea for Hector Man, and he liked the like setup of it being a professor studying Hector's work, and he didn't know where to go from there, and he just went in an insane direction. There's also like some racist and ableist characters in there. I don't even want to like touch on that because they are very minor figures, but it did make me uncomfortable. There was like this random other plot, which was that the professor had a job translating Memoirs from Beyond the Grave by Chateaubriand into English, and there were entire passages of Memoirs from Beyond the Grave printed in this book, including epigraph at the beginning. And what did that have to do with anything? I don't know. And it didn't. And then the thing is that like it didn't have anything to do with fucking anything. That's how I felt about that. It made me really unhappy. And yeah, I hated this book. So let's finish strong. The last book I bought, and the book I'm actually currently reading, and like big drum roll here, is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I'm 10 pages in. You might be wondering, Lily, you have an American accent. Like, how did you get your hands on the UK copy? Because I found the American cover of this novel to be so fugly that it made me ill, and it made me want to vomit. And so I went onto a British bookseller's website, and I ordered a copy of the book, and they shipped it, and I actually didn't have to pay international shipping, which is great. So it didn't even cost that much, and I had it shipped to me, and so that's why it took a little bit to get here. It took about 2 weeks to get here, maybe less, maybe like 10 days. And so I'm finally getting to it. I only received it in the mail a few days ago. This is so much better than the American cover. Like, are you fucking joking? The American cover literally makes me want to gouge my eyes out. I'm 10 pages in. I'm so excited. I saw someone on the internet, on TikTok, I think, say that they actually think of Sally Rooney as like an underrated writer, even though she is one of the most famous contemporary writers. And I actually 100% agree. And I really understand what he was trying to say, because I feel like her work is constantly misunderstood and like devalued, probably because she writes a lot about sex and relationships, and she's a woman. But even though her books are like so well reviewed and like are so popular and they sell so well and they like have TV adaptations, I feel like people just don't really understand her, and they don't understand how important what she's doing is, or like even what her impact has been. All young female writers literally sound just like her, and the male writers do too, actually. And I feel like she's like almost single-handedly responsible for this like weird, not weird, like I love it, popularity of Irish culture and like Ireland in general. At least in the US, like there's been this like maybe resurgence, but just this like surge of popularity with all things Irish. And I feel like that is so directly related to Sally Rooney. And I don't know, I feel like we're going to be studying this impact of Sally Rooney for years to come. And I feel like we're just too close to it right now to even like see it. But the fact that this is only her 4th book and she's so established, I literally think that she is a modern classic. Like her books will be considered classics in the future. I genuinely believe that. Like, she is such an important writer, her impact is just like can't be understated. So in that way, I do feel like she is underrated, because I feel like she gets lumped in with a lot of other like contemporary writers as like what's cool now. And I do feel like her writing will live on for a long time, and she is not going to be a forgotten author, but I guess only time will tell, because I'm sure people said that about Jane Smiley, and it's like, who's still talking about Jane Smiley? Fucking no one. Well, I am. So I'm so excited about this book. Already the first 10 pages, like, this feels like a major transition for her. It feels like she's trying something new and like is really developing as a writer, and I feel like it's the perfect time for her to be doing that. Writing style is just like completely different. Again, I've only read the first 10 pages, but it just feels like completely different characters that are similar, but it just, I don't know, like, if something feels different about this one. So I'm really excited to see if that ends up being true. So that's all the books. Those are the 5 books I read recently and the 5 books I purchased recently, and that's about all I have to share. I've been talking for over an hour and I really want to go get a snack and maybe watch Gilmore Girls. So that's it. Bye.